Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology. Hi there.
Hi there.
I'm really excited about sharing this episode with our listeners.
I am too. I listened to it again this morning. I'm so happy.
We've been working on this one for a little while. We went on a really long road trip a couple of months ago out to Arizona and to New Mexico and had a blast, as we do. But as part of that road trip, we spent a few days with our friend John Birdsall and his husband Perry at their beautiful home in Tucson, Arizona. From that came a conversation that we're going to share with you today.
John has been my friend for over 30 years, which is really just a very strange thing to think about.
Right.
John is a food writer, a gay man, and he really focuses on who people are, what food is, why it matters. But as we were talking about who I might interview this year, people who I find interesting, I'm always interested in where God meets people, where their spirituality shows up in ways that aren't necessarily obvious, that don't obviously have God attached to them. I'm interested in hearing where people have experiences of holiness and depth and bigger than this worldness. And John clearly has that, both in his experiences of life, but also in his experiences of food and how that interacts. I just thought it would be great for our listeners, for y'all, to hear how God meets John and lots of other people in that experience of the things we eat.
John is the author of a book called The Man Who Ate Too Much, which is a biography of the life of James Beard, which you'll hear him talk about in the interview. He also has a Substack.
johnbirdsall.substack.com.
Easy. I think you guys will really enjoy his writing style as much as you will enjoy this interview.
Yeah.
Here's Elane's chat with John Birdsall.
Hey, John, it is so wonderful that you let us into your home, invading your brain, invading your history, basically recounting every drop of your life since I have known you. Oof. So thank you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm usually working here by myself in my magnificent solitude at the southern tip of Arizona. So, so it's great to have invaders.
Well, we love invading. So could you tell our folks just a little bit about who you are? And then I'll go back to, how I know you.
So I am a writer. Still feels funny saying that after all these years. As you know, I started in the kitchen. I started as a chef, worked in restaurant kitchens for almost 20 years in San Francisco and in Chicago. And then in 2002, I officially started calling myself a writer. So I've been writing about food since then, writing essays and journalism about food and about the queer experience of food. And then in the year 2020, my publisher Norton released my first solo book, which is called The Man Who Ate Too Much, a biography of James Beard. And I'm now working on my second book for Norton, which I know we'll talk about.
You said that this was your first solo book. What did you do before this?
Yeah, so before this, in 2018, with Oakland chef James Siabut, we collaborated on a book called Hawker Fare, which is an Isan Lao book and memoir about James's experience growing up as a Lao refugee in Oakland with his family. And then, James had grown up in this really lively Thai and Lao refugee community in Oakland, refugees from the Vietnam War, but also, swept up all of Southeast Asia.
Sure.
And then James became a fine dining chef, but had no experience cooking the Lao food that he loved and that he grew up with. And in fact, had been sort of ashamed of as a kid. And so we took a couple of long trips to Southeast Asia where he reconnected with the food at the source. So that was a really satisfying project.
What was it like to be along with him as he rediscovered this thing?
It was, moving, revealing, exhausting too, because we took long trips and It was pretty much like eating boot camp, where it'd be like, up at 6 a.m. We had this van and this great driver who would sort of take us around. And we focused really on northern Thailand, Isan, and then on a second trip, we went to Laos.
Wow.
But it was just, eating at truck stops, eating at any restaurant that seemed as if it had a local specialty of some kind. So yeah, it was fascinating. It was delicious, I have to say.
So you and I have known each other. I was trying to calculate this not too long ago. Yeah. We met in 1989, 1991, somewhere in there. You were working at Real Foods.
Right, at the Real Food Company on Polk Street in San Francisco.
Right.
I think it must have been 1990.
Must have been.
That's my best guess.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember which girlfriend I was with, because that would actually tell me when it was.
Yeah.
But
I don't think I knew. I'm all right. It's not something that's stuck.
No, it wouldn't be something in your head. The way I knew you was I was working at this deli that had great food, like it had deli dish type food that people would buy in pints and quarts and so forth. And there was this guy in the attic who made the food.
Yeah, the kitchen was upstairs from the store. It was a sort of natural foods grocery store that kind of morphed into a sort of fancy deli. In essence, Whole Foods sort of copied this whole concept, but Real Foods was, really, they put a lot of care and thought into making food that would be delicious, that would be well seasoned, well cooked. We're constantly tasting and reseasoning things. A salad that would sit in the deli case for half a day, something like that.
Right.
And trying to give it an emphasis of produce, fruit, local produce when we could. So yeah, I'd sort of taken my restaurant experience and worked with the manager there, Chris Leishman, the kitchen manager, who was great and inspiring, and asked if I would come and work with her. So we were cooking this food, and I remember you would come up, there was the service elevator.
Right.
That would come up into the kitchen, and you would sort of get bowls and containers of salads to take downstairs and put in the case.
Right.
And that's actually my memory of you is coming out of the service elevator with a cart to come and get more like, Moroccan carrot salad or Chinese noodle salad.
I totally forgot about the Moroccan carrot. The Chinese noodle I tried to replicate the other day using the recipe that you pointed me to, and I was like, I can't do this.
Yeah, and it's something that it's like there was something a little, I would say gross about it, but I wouldn't really eat that way anymore because I had like tons of like black Chinese soy sauce and lots of sugar to sort of balance it.
Yeah. As I remember, there were recipes that had nothing to do with you, the recipes that you did, there were other kinds of things. And what I remember most about the food, besides the noodle salad, which everybody loved and you would now never eat, was that it was the first time I'd ever had minestrone and thought, oh my goodness.
Oh, yeah.
I want to eat this forever.
Oh, yeah. I used to like making that.
And you said something about the Parmesan rind or something like that.
Exactly.
You wouldn't have said adding umami, but essentially adding that depth.
Right. I don't think yeah. So we would save the rinds from, I think we used Grana Padano. We used like Italian Grana Padano for other things. Mm-hmm. And then, we would save up these rinds and then flavor the broth for the minestrone, which is something that we learned from Marcella Hazan, the great Italian cookbook author, who inspires lots of fan devotion.
Mm-hmm. Her bolognese. I remember her bolognese is the thing that I hear about all the time.
She's got this almost a cult following for, so it's a pasta sauce. So it's tomatoes, onions, and butter.
Yes.
Cooked a long time. And there's like there's like TikTok videos and just like lots of Marcella love for that sauce. But we would learn so this is whatever, late 80s, early 90s, and there weren't nearly as many, in English, like great Italian cookbooks and cookbook authors. But she was like the queen of this kind of eye-opening, like regional Italian cooking.
Well, so I didn't know Marcella Hazan at all. And I started cooking really when I was about 5 or 6 and was doing pretty much all the cooking in my household from a very young age. So cooking to me was, I enjoyed doing it. but I didn't really know much about it above that level.
Yeah.
And so when you said that, it just kind of made me go, right? Like my brain just suddenly went, oh, it was so new for me. So for me, that minestrone is the John Birdsall minestrone,
yeah.
regardless of whether Marcello Hazan had anything to do with it or not.
Well, I have to say that by the time I got to it, it was filtered through Green's restaurant, which is where I worked before. I had a few jobs before, but before the Real Food Company, that's where I really started making it. And of course, because it was Green's, the sort of great San Francisco vegetarian restaurant, it was made without meat, made without, poultry. And so, yeah, at Green's, really kind of learning how to do meatless cooking that had kind of a deep foundation of flavor, so making vegetable stocks for a soup like that, but kind of really tailoring. This is an idea that blew my mind as a young cook from Green's, instead of just making a blanket vegetable stock to use, really kind of tailoring a stock like that to use for a specific soup.
Am I right that you did not go to cooking school? Am I remembering that
I did not go
correctly?
to cooking school. Yeah. So I started cooking in a weird time and place. I mean, it was, San Francisco, and I think I started working at Green's, I think it was 82 or 83. And, Green's was run directly by San Francisco Zen Center as a practice place for Zen students.
Right.
And I was one of the few or first non-Zen students who was actually allowed to work there.
Okay.
Green's was almost like a spin-off of Chez Panisse.
Right.
Deborah
that's
Madison,
in Berkeley. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Right.
sort of famous Alice Waters institution that's still thriving.
Right.
And so, Deborah Madison, who was a Zen priest, but also did some shifts in the pastry department at Chez Panisse, when she opened Green's for Zen Center, it sort of brought the same kind of kitchen culture that had existed at Chez Panisse to some extent.
Okay.
And part of that culture was there was a value on being placed on being an amateur. And so like Alice, a lot of the famous cooks who had worked there, a lot of them didn't have formal kitchen training, but they came to cooking from a love of certain cookbook authors like Marcella, especially Elizabeth David, huge, the British cookbook author, Jane Gregson, Richard Olney for sure. And there was almost a kind of a snobbery, this kind of a weird, like reverse snobbery. Like in those days, a culinary education was, like that's what you did if you wanted to get a union cooking job in a hotel or something.
Oh, gotcha.
So there was a lot, and hotel restaurants were not that good at that time. And so if you really committed, if you really loved cooking, you'd be into the literature of cooking. You would be into these amazing guides, these authors who wrote about cooking in a certain way. And so, really to get my job to sort of prove that I was passionate and committed to cooking in a certain way, I just immersed myself in those authors, especially Elizabeth David and Richard Olney as well. And that's what sort of gave you your credibility in that world, in that culture. But of course, the downside is that the knowledge we had was really from experience only. We had no training. And so when something that required technical knowledge or expertise happened, for instance, we would have to make a large quantity of garlic mayonnaise,
Right.
aioli, and we were required to do it by hand, just a bowl and a whisk. I know. We couldn't use the food processor.
Sorry, for those of you who can't see me, I'm rolling my eyes right now.
It was like the hardcore,
Yeah.
That was like the hardcore kitchen.
Did you have to put on the robes first and like tie them around? No? Okay.
Yeah, essentially.
Okay.
But then, you'd get 10 cups into this mayonnaise, and if it broke, nobody knew how to fix it.
Right.
And so you'd have to call somebody. So I remember there was always somebody at Chez Panisse who, like the head of the kitchen at Green's, would call and be like, "What? How do you fix it again?" And he'd be like, "Okay,
Wow.
get boiling water. Start over with new eggs, whatever." And it was just like, oof. So even though we looked down on formal kitchen training, there was something useful about having that training.
It's interesting to me and inspiring, and one of the many things I love about you, besides your writing, which is a whole other thing. It's interesting to me that cooking has stayed a current for you? Like even when you left professional cooking, and I know that Real Foods was not your last professional cooking job, but when you left, as I recall, when you left professional cooking, you did not put it this way. I am being blunt. But you said something along the lines of you were tired of cooking for people who didn't care about cooking.
Right. Yeah. That's right. I probably did say that.
Yeah. I mean, something in that. It's something in that way. And we're going on to thinking about it differently, right?
Yeah.
But saying that says a lot about your relationship with cooking, right? And your relationship with feeding people and their appreciation. And there's both a sense of community in that, but there's also, I hear it as whether a longing is getting taken care of, either the cook's longing or the eater's longing, whatever that is. But there's something in that seems very like a river runs through it. You know what I mean? There's something in that.
So I came to food through this love of food writing. And so cooking on my own at home was some way of trying to capture that, even though I was not a good cook when I started and didn't know what I was doing. And then getting a job in a restaurant, my job at Green's was essentially, we wouldn't call it, but it was essentially an apprenticeship where it was just focusing on certain simple tasks. And because there was this very quiet Soto Zen culture in the restaurant, it was all about really staying mindful of your breath, your body's position while you were doing these very repetitive jobs, to say chop 6 cups of mixed herbs in a shift, or, prep and wash 3 crates of lettuce for the evening. And so then when I actually, advanced to being able to work on the kitchen line, to work on the salad station at lunch or the pizza station at lunch, it was kind of a rude awakening because I realized that cooking was not this kind of romantic, word-based, food writing-based endeavor that I loved. It was really about physical stamina and hand-eye coordination.
Yes.
You're just getting in a groove on the line. You're cranking out, 30 lunch salad specials in a day, plus all the other stuff that came from the salad station. And so there's this great satisfaction that came from getting into the groove and learning how to do that well and efficiently, where you're not wasting physical movements. It involves your body and not your mind so much, or your imagination. It's really a physical thing, which is cool. And also that culture of restaurants in the Bay Area that sprang from Chez Panisse, the sort of mantra of those restaurants was community. Alice Waters' vision was that food brings people around the table, and not only the community of eaters, but the community of small local farmers. So cooking and sourcing food in a certain way created this community that could change the world, that could change the heartless, globe-destroying, climate-destroying food system in America. And this food system that had developed in a way that sort of kept people from really connecting at the table, coming together for family dinner. So there was this myth, I think, that we all told ourselves that we were cooking for a community. But the reality was you're cooking for an affluent group of diners who can afford to be at the restaurant.
Sure.
So whatever, BS there was about bringing everyone together, the everyone was people with enough money to come to the restaurant and who had the same kind of aesthetic appreciation, which took a certain background, certain level of education. There was no talk of farm workers. We had no talk back then of those questions of like equity. When Slow Food America arrived, unlike the Italian movement, which really was focused on social justice in many ways, it was food that was fair. It was good, clean, and then the third part of the slow food slogan was fair. In America, my experience of it, working in those restaurants, was that the fair part nobody really thought about that much, or they might have paid lip service.
Right.
But nobody at that point was thinking about unionizing farm labor in Watsonville.
Right.
I mean, there was one strawberry grower, Swanson Berries, and they were really proud that they had, a union contract with their workers.
Right.
But that was nothing that anybody talked about. And so at some point, I kind of felt I was done with that myth that food builds community, and tired of the people I cooked for not really being people in a community that I wanted to feed, necessarily wanted to feed. I mean, I was fine having a job and cooking for people and doing food that I felt proud of and that I thought was important in some way. But it was really an exaggeration, if not a lie, to say that it was nurturing a community, which eventually I think, made me question who my community was. At that time during the 80s, in San Francisco especially, there was this terrible HIV and AIDS pandemic that showed eventually, after the first few years of just fear and panic, I think that eventually showed the strengths and it showed the weaknesses of at that time I considered the gay community much more my community. But that experience of AIDS really highlighted what was deficient about that community, but also where I might fit in. It sort of gave me an opening to figure out who my community was and what work I could do in that community that would kind of satisfy my need to feel like I was doing something important.
So many things in that. So let's stay on that shift in your understanding of community and where your community was for a minute. As I recall Chez Panisse, and this may be a false memory, but I recall there being a communal table. I don't remember why I think this. It may be a false memory, but the idea of it connects to so many communal tables in very broadly spiritual traditions. So you've got the communal table of, the Christian Lord's Supper. You've got the communal table of a monastery. You've got the communal table in Zen. I mean, you have these various kinds of communal tables. And I'm thinking in that sense of who sits around that communal table, right? And you're talking about now that sense of who sits around your communal table. Like, who are you doing stuff for? Who are you doing it with? Where do you see yourself? How is that being built? Really coming into a clearer sight during this horrible, horrible crisis in San Francisco and elsewhere.
Yeah, and I mean, it was something that I really struggled with at the time. For instance, at some point in the 1980s, a woman named Ruth Brinker launched a nonprofit called Open Hand that would basically fundraise and solicit donations and prepare meals for people with AIDS and deliver them to them in their homes. And that was something, people I worked with would volunteer at Open Hand, and it's something that I thought about, but for some reason that didn't feel like it was my way. And I'm not proud of that. The reality of that decade and that crisis was that there was no end of, shame and guilt about my own reaction to the crisis and what I did in response to it. And at the same time, the reality of that, especially before there was any testing, certainly before there were any experimental drugs, but before there was even any effective testing, there was just that sense, that assumption that myself and people I knew, men that I knew, that we probably had all been infected with HIV, and that it was just a matter of time, before we would have full-blown AIDS and die. So there was also that sense of like a fatalistic idea that we had better do something self-fulfilling, because we were not going to be around for very much longer.
Right.
And yeah, I really struggled with the idea of who my community was and what what I could best do that was expressing myself, my point of view. I mean, that sounds incredibly selfish to me now to even use a term like point of view to talk about, like trying to find myself. It wasn't really that. It was like what felt urgent, what felt the most urgent thing for me to do. And to be honest with myself, doing sort of volunteer or community work didn't feel like the most urgent thing for me to be doing. I mean, I suppose if I had a different kind of faith, kind of experience with faith, I would say my calling, what I was being called to do. I already had this feeling that food was my way of experiencing the world. Cooking in a certain way, cooking in a way that I felt preserved I guess you'd say the spirit of the produce, of the vegetables. I remember having a really difficult day at Greens where I was like overwhelmed, I was tired, and I was, upset about something and crying. And there was a little community garden in a field that was sort of above the restaurant. And I remember going there to chill out and sitting on the edge of this bed and seeing these tomatoes growing and, almost like Scarlett O'Hara, like
right.
picking the carrots and saying, I'll never be hungry again. It was like, I remember talking to the beautiful heirloom tomato growing and saying, whatever I said, I will always be true to you.
Yeah.
I will not fuck you up. I will not do ridiculous things to you.
Right.
Felt like this is a miraculous thing.
Yes.
When you see things growing, it does seem incredibly kind of sobering, like miraculous thing, even if you don't overtly believe in miracles. And just felt like whatever I did as a cook, my job was not to violate this sort of beautiful, powerful, vibrant thing that was much older, had this sort of mystery about it. So in terms of looking at this kind of calamity that was happening all around me, I just, I wondered, how did I fit in? How could I use my talents to be present, to do something urgent in this community? I remember read an interview where the poet Tom Gunn, a great gay poet who lived in San Francisco, wrote poems about the AIDS crisis. And in an interview, he was asked sort of talk about the community, and he felt like the phrase, the gay community, he always felt that it was bullshit until he really needed it.
Right.
During the height of the AIDS crisis. So I think I felt in a similar way that just really heightened that I needed to do something. It didn't clarify what it was at the time, that I needed to do, but I was sort of committed to cooking in a certain way, and that felt urgent and important.
We talk about many different kinds of service, and well, I think my bet is all religious traditions, but I know of at least 3 this is true, so I can go with that. There is a sense that you do service to other people because it disciplines your own spirit, because it is good for you to serve other people, right? So you serve in order to gain humility. You serve in order to put yourself in somebody else's place. You serve for those reasons. And those are all totally legit reasons. Then there's the kind of service that comes out of a particular compassion for a particular outcome for a particular set of people, right? So on the days when I would rather not be kind to my daughter, I am kind to my daughter because I respect her and want her to do well, right? So there's that. Then there's another kind of service that comes out of where our passions and the needs of the world meet. That idea that who we are deeply and what the world needs, there is a certain kind of magic or miracle when those two intersect, when we see the deepest reality of the world's pain or any community's pain, and what we have that is special and unique that nobody else can do exactly like us. And this doesn't have to be highfalutin, right? It's not this great calling that if you don't do it, you've missed it and it will never happen. But it is about that very specific, unique connection between who we are, our experience, our gifts, our talents, the things we love, blah, 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 blah. All of those are good. I think there's a tendency to think that one or the other is correct. And the other two stink, right? So you're seeing a lot of need out there. You don't feel like Project Open Hand is your particular bent. So that means you suck, right? Or you see the need out there and you do it because it's important to do, which is great. But eventually it exhausts you, right? No matter who you are, everybody. It exhausts you because it's all about putting it out. And then there are the times when you discover those things where who you are on the deepest level intersect this magical way. So I first became aware of HIV and AIDS really early because I happened to be working near UCLA, and they happened to be looking for gay men to come in to run through some blood tests kind of thing. And I happened to know someone who knew about, who was doing that. But by the time I moved to San Francisco and it had become, a thing, and I'm putting it that way deliberately, it had become a thing, where I was in life had changed a lot. So I was already serving a lot through social justice stuff, and I loved doing all of it. But I think the part that mattered to me the most was actually having contact with people who were dealing with crap, And there's nothing wrong with that, even if it was one person at a time for 10 minutes at a time, rather than 30 people getting fed.
Right.
So I hear you on that, and I think just for our listeners, I really want to lift up that serving is good. And if you are doing good in the world, that is a good thing. And it is completely legitimate to say, I can do this, and I will if I need, but if I can do something else that is also my specific thing.
Right.
Yeah. So part of where I hear you going with this is kind of what your specific thing turned out to be.
Yeah, it was finding that specific thing. For me, really, it was unexpectedly, I guess, feeling like it was finding a voice, which, again, in that all of that cloud of shame and guilt that had to do with what was happening and my response to it, that could seem, finding my own voice, it feels, it could be self-indulgent. It's like, oh, I really needed to find myself at this time when people were just, struggling in so many other ways. But yeah, having the opportunity, which I kind of stumbled into with this LGBT weekly paper, The Sentinel, and having this arts editor who was looking for somebody to write about food. And I heard about it from a friend and went and spoke with this editor, Eric Hellman, and he was looking for somebody to write about food in a different way than really had been done in these free weeklies that served the LGBTQ community, especially at the time of AIDS, offered a lot of information, opinion, news. But yeah, just kind of wanted to treat food in a different way. And so eventually writing for that and feeling like I could have a voice and find an audience and feel that people were paying attention. I wrote a couple of food features for this paper, The Sentinel. I remember, I think the second one I wrote about strawberries. I was trying to sort of find my way. It was, ultimately writing about pleasure. I felt like that was my thing, and sort of writing about pleasure, the pleasure of eating, the pleasure of just these beautiful ingredients themselves. And I wrote about fraises des bois, which are they're called wild, but they're actually cultivated, these tiny European strawberries that are thimble-sized, fingernail-sized, have this intense sweet fragrance. And so I wrote about them as part of this story, and I got a letter from this guy who said that he was a gardener, and he cultivated the gardens. So at the top of this fancy hotel in San Francisco, the Fairmont Hotel, they had these kind of beautiful gardens that you could walk through, but I don't think a lot of people knew about them or walked through them. As a landscaper, his job was to cultivate these gardens. And he was really proud of the fact, he wrote in his letter, that one of the ornamental plants that he had planted, although you could eat them, were these fraises des bois, these little wild strawberries. And he asked in the letter if I wanted to come and see his garden. So I absolutely went. He was totally sweet, said, he loved the article. And yeah, we connected. He showed me the garden. He was obviously really proud of it. And then I didn't hear from him again. And then they always had these, there were always many, obituaries from people who had died because of AIDS complications. In the Bay Area Reporter, which was another weekly, I just sort of randomly noticed that this guy had actually died. And it was difficult, but I also felt like I had connected with him. And that gave me comfort too. Because to connect with somebody, author to reader I'm always grateful for that. But to connect in that specific way about something, especially that with this really sort of intense kind of flavor, something that, even though we weren't eating them together, is this shared experience.
Right.
We both had the knowledge of how intensely pleasurable that experience is to sort of experience these strawberries. And so it was, connecting with somebody in a way that felt like it was absolutely where I needed to be, where my voice could potentially matter.
So in my business, we talk about that as holiness, that these are holy moments. They are imbued with something bigger. And the something bigger may be simply the meeting of souls. It may be that you used your own experience and your respect for the strawberries, your respect for the tomato, your devotion to that little miracle of planthood, and the way you talked about it, it reached somebody whose soul needed to hear it, who needed to be met. Ben and I talk about, that God always meets us where we are. If we're open to God, God's always meeting us where we are. And what I hear in your story is the divine, whether you call it spirit, whether you call it God, whatever, meeting this fellow, this gardener, this man nurturing this beauty, these smells, God meeting him, God meeting you, and making that connection. God, the ultimate maven, right? There's something so precious in that, and so life-affirming in that, in the midst of all that death, that, of course, it was meaningful to you. Of course, it shined a light on something you could do that was yours. Of course it did. And from my perspective, whether it's your perspective or not, from my perspective, that's God saying, okay, John, I've given you this gift. I'm setting you up for this. You're now getting this feedback. Go do this thing.
Right.
And personally, as someone who reads your work and loves your work, I'm so grateful. You didn't say, go to hell with you, God. I'm not going to do this. Right? Because it isn't easy work. Writing is lonely and hard, and sometimes you get feedback, and sometimes it's just rough. And we both write, both Ben and I write in different ways, and it's hard darn work. But I'm so grateful that the fraises des bois, is that how you pronounce it? How do you pronounce the flowers? The strawberries?
The fraises des bois.
Fraises des bois.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that the fraises des bois made that connection between you and honestly the rest of us. Because you continue to do that. You continue to help God meet us. So you put out a book in 2020 called The Man Who Ate Too Much. And it is a biography of James Beard, who was an iconic American celebrity chef before there were celebrity chefs.
Right.
In a particular way, who was also gay and also had parts of his life that people knew and people didn't know and that he hid, and there were all of those complexities of being this person.
Yeah.
Right? Is that a fair way of putting it for the moment?
Yes, I think that's great.
Okay. One of the things you did so magnificently in that was show the complexities of being any human being, but particularly James Beard, with all of it. Is there anything in particular about that book that kind of ties back to this sense of your own calling, your own expression, you're reaching through the strawberry?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. So I grew up in a suburb of San Francisco. It was pretty conservative, socially pretty conservative. And our neighbors were this gay couple, Pat and Lou. And my parents became very, very close to them, very good friends. And so they became like uncles to me. I used to call them Uncle Pat and Uncle Lou. I was too young to think about, I knew that they were a couple, that they lived together. I was too young to think much more than that about it, and just that I loved them. I loved the life that they seemed to have, the joy and the pleasure that they had. When we would get together with my parents and they'd have cocktail parties and things like that. And then when I got older, Pat, one of the men, died suddenly, unexpectedly, when I was 11. And I realized that what they had together couldn't exist for very long. That, Pat's family got involved and they had never approved of Pat's life with Lou. And, they insisted that the house be sold and all of that. They came and took all of Pat's possessions. It was as if Lou, who was essentially Pat's husband, didn't exist. They wanted to erase the life that they had and erase the importance of Lou in Pat's life. And I, witnessed all of this as a little kid without really realizing all of what it meant.
Of course.
I knew the joy and happiness and how it would happen with food too, food and drinking and parties. And then when all of that was gone, it just seemed like, where did it go? Right. It just vanished. It was so fragile, as it turned out.
Yeah.
It was so easy for the world to forget about it. And the world wanted to forget about it all along. The other neighbors didn't approve of my parents' friendship with these men, and certainly not having, their boys, me and my brother, be partly raised by these guys.
Right.
That experience of wanting to explore the history of a couple like that, who would have lived in the 1960s, would have crossed over some of the same historical era that James Beard lived in.
Oh, sure.
So I felt like I had some understanding of that generation. James Beard was older. He was born in 1903. I wanted to understand the experience of queer people who lived at that time, a very challenging, difficult, punishing time for queer people. And so I felt like, the book really came from that emotional place in me, the feeling of wanting to find this lost world, find the emotions of this lost world, and to try to understand the experience of, people like Pat and Lou, who I loved. And I had no way, as I was discovering my own sexuality and coming out, I would have loved to have had them as kind of my elders to help me through a lot of things, and they had been wiped away. So the Beard books very much came from trying to reclaim that in my own life.
It is one of the gifts of that book that you give a certain kind of elderness into the world, your own, but also Beard's, and the struggles of all of those things, and the joys and the remarkableness.
Yeah, and I also, almost as a form of protest, I wanted to make the point, not very subtle point, that someone like James Beard, who lived precariously in many ways.
Good word.
You know, he was one of the most sort of famous Americans for a good 2 decades, you know, the 1960s and 70s, even into the 80s. You know, he had a very distinctive physical presence, you know, very, very large man, bald, you know, liked to be photographed, smiling, laughing, had this very kind of affable public persona. But sort of looking through that, and then also making the point that this person who didn't have an easy identity, that he influenced the way that Americans ate in much, much larger ways. And then just also really ultimately wouldn't be appreciated for that. In part because of the sort of difficulty of kind of embracing who he was. So.
It reminds me a little bit of the movie Hidden Figures, that what you've called excavation, right? And excavation both of history and of people in history, but also ourselves and who we are and how we matter and how we connect.
Yeah.
I think you found that way of serving. Yeah, and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah.
And that was Elane's chat with John Birdsall from the kitchen of John and Perry's home in Tucson, Arizona. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. You can find John again at johnbirdsall.substack.com, and you can also pick up his book, The Man Who Ate Too Much, a biography of James Beard. Cocktail Theology comes out with new episodes every Thursday, and we love when you guys subscribe. It really helps other people find us, so I hope that you'll subscribe and share us with your friends on your socials and all that. Also, we are always looking for comments, suggestions for episodes and for cocktails. You can find us at cocktailtheology.com, and you can contact us there. Hope you'll join us again next time for another new episode. We have more interviews with friends in the longer form coming up later this season. We hope you'll stay tuned. Bye.